Thank you, Serge. It's a great pleasure being part of this Transporian for the Future initiative. It's good to see my university, KLU, strengthening its links with Transporian, and it's great to see some of our master's students actually participating in the hackathon today. I hope you've all had a very creative brainstorming session over the past 2 days, and hope you're generating lots of implementable ideas. So this presentation doesn't relate directly to the 5 projects you've been working on. Rather, it's looking, I suppose, at the bigger picture, which will help to contextualize some of the work that you have been doing. Because my feeling is that people focusing these days on the decarbonization of long-haul road freight are obsessed with vehicle technology. And they also confine their attention to Europe. Whereas if we have to decarbonize long-haul trucking, we've got to do it at a global level. And we should take a look at the sort of international dimension. And that's what I'm going to be doing in this short presentation. But I thought what would be helpful initially would be give people a sense of the challenge that we will have, even just here in Europe, in decarbonizing road freight transport. Because, as Elizabeth Werner said in her keynote yesterday morning, the EU has set this target of reducing transport emissions by 90% by 2050. And that applies to freight as well as passenger transport. So how might we do that as far as freight is concerned? Well, we can construct scenarios. Here's one scenario, right, in which we would transfer about a third of ton kilometers from road to rail, and in the meantime, hope that the railways would reduce their carbon intensity by 80%. We could then have a 25% improvement in the efficiency of truck routing in Europe, 30% increase in the load factors of the vehicles, 30% reduction in the empty running of the trucks, 50% increase in truck energy efficiency, and a 60% drop in the carbon content of the energy. And factoring all of those things together would deliver that 90% reduction in carbon emissions. But that's only one scenario. This would be an alternative scenario where we placed greater emphasis on switching to low carbon energy away from fossil fuel. Because if that then accounted for a bigger share of the reduction, it would then take the pressure off those other parameters, as I've illustrated there. But I mean, people who work in the road freight sector in Europe would know how challenging it would be to achieve all of these things, even over a period of several decades. But we don't have that time because it's the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere which drives climate change. We're working to stay within carbon budgets. It's not that we're simply aiming to have a particular level of emissions at some date in the future. It's the accumulated emissions that matter. So let's look at one scenario here, which would see emissions from road freight in Europe peaking in 2025 and then dropping reasonably gradually. Or we could delay till 2035 and then there'll be a much more precipitate drop in those emissions. Now, if we compare those two scenarios, delaying to 2035 in the meantime would put about 28% more CO2 into the atmosphere and make it much harder for us to stay within our respective carbon budgets. So the key point to make here is we have to act urgently to achieve deep reductions in our road freight emissions. Now, I said a moment ago that it seems to be many people these days are preoccupied with the alternative powertrains for low carbon energy. You can see the options there. Is it going to be battery powered vehicles, or will we use hydrogen fuel cells, or will we electrify the highways and have what they call a catenary system? There's a possibility we could use synthetic fuel or even biogas like biomethane. And to complicate matters further, there are hybrid combinations of all of these various powertrain technologies. Now, there have been some studies done in recent years comparing these different options in terms of their environmental impact, their economic impact, also the technological risks. One of the first comparisons was done by the Eco Institute in Germany. In September last year, Pricewaterhouse's division called Strategy Plus, again, published an interesting report on the subject. And then the most recent one I have seen was done by Shell and Deloitte, published just about a month ago. Very difficult to compare the results of these studies because they use different criteria. Their analysis is based on different data sets. They make different assumptions. So there's currently wide disagreement as to what the right decarbonisation pathway will be. Already we've seen lobbies building up, promoting particular energy types and powertrain developments. So it's very hard to know what the relative proportions of these technologies will be. And it's also worth noting that different governments are now, and different truck manufacturers are exhibiting different preferences for particular low-carbon powertrains and energies. But I think many people currently feel that there's no one-size-fits-all, that it's not as if one of these technologies or energy sources will triumph and will completely dominate things. The feeling is that they will coexist and they will compete. And that's what I've tried to illustrate on this slide, making the point that there are probably what I call operational sweet spots for these different technologies. And I'm defining these sweet spots with respect to two variables. One is the payload weight that's being transported, and the second thing is the trip length as well. And you can see by looking at those diagrams how the different technologies are positioned differently in these different operating spaces as well. Now, for those trucking companies that are specialized, that they only tend to move freight over a certain distance, or they only move a particular category of commodity, then the choice of technology may be quite obvious. But of course, in Europe, many trucking companies are what we call general hauliers. They want to have the flexibility to carry a range of commodities, to move over different distance ranges, to have different duty cycles. And for them, it might be a difficult choice as to which would be the right one for them. And I think there's another problem with what I call the multiple technology scenario, which is that in the end, it will result in us spreading the available capital investment by manufacturing capacity for the trucks, but also in terms of the infrastructure that these different technologies require. So that if one takes a sort of European-wide perspective on this, it may not make the best use of the available investment capital. But the other thing is, whichever of those options is the one which dominates, and however the mix develops, we have to face the fact that these are long-term developments. The PricewaterhouseCoopers report I mentioned to you a moment ago, they have this graph where they look at the rate at which we will migrate from internal combustion engine trucks to alternative energy trucks, either powered by battery or fuel cells. And you can see by 2030, they reckon that 90% of the vehicle truck movements in Europe will still be diesel powered. Even by 2035, they reckon more than half the truck movements will be diesel powered. Now, of course, in the meantime, the fuel efficiency of that diesel haulage will improve because the European Union has in place fuel economy standards, so that by 2025, new trucks will have to be at least 15% more carbon efficient than the average new truck in 2019. And by 2030, there'll have to be a 30% improvement in the carbon efficiency of the vehicles, right? So even before we shift energy source, the diesel vehicles will become more energy efficient. But again, that depends on the rate at which we replace the current vehicle fleet. And it's possible using Eurostat data to estimate how long it takes to replace the European truck fleet. So using 2017 data, to completely replace all those vehicles on average would take about 13 years, right? If you weight the analysis by the number of ton kilometers run in different countries in Europe, it's slightly longer. It's about 14 years. So it takes a while, right? Now, of course, that process could be accelerated with regulation introduced by national governments or the EU, or even by fiscal incentives. The government could incentivize a more rapid switch to alternative fuel vehicles, but it could also be slowed by other things, because the new generation of battery or fuel cell vehicles are going to have a higher total cost of ownership. A lot of carriers will wonder about the residual value of these vehicles after 5, 6, 10 years. And also there's a question about how quickly we can put the infrastructure in place to support the new generation of low carbon vehicles. And if we look at this at a country level, something that's not widely known is that the country in Europe with by far the largest truck fleet is actually Poland. And, currently it takes over 20 years for the Polish truck fleet to be replaced. So these are all long-term measures, whereas, as I said earlier, we have to drive down road freight emissions in the near future, certainly within the next 10 years. And for that reason, therefore, we have got to look at a whole range of decarbonisation initiatives. This is a graph you often see these days on transport decarbonisation reports. It's what we call an abatement implementation graph. So on the vertical axis, we have got the level of CO2 savings that you can derive from these initiatives. And on the horizontal axis, we have got the ease and the speed of implementation. Now, the good news is that there are a great many things that we can do to decarbonise road freight, as you can see there. My colour coding differentiates the ones which are essentially technical or infrastructural, and the sort of softer measures, which are operational, managerial, regulatory. And what you tend to find is that the blue ones tend to be skewed towards the right side of the diagram. And in other words, these are the things that can be implemented more easily and more quickly, often with a lower carbon mitigation cost as well. Now, it seems to me, having done a lot of work in this area, that policymakers, managers, I think, underestimate the contribution that can be made by these short-term operational, managerial, and regulatory options. And I think they deserve more attention. And this, I think, is where we also must refer to digitalization, because that is reinforcing these operational and managerial measures. I put there the sort of suite of computing, communication, artificial intelligence initiatives, which we put under this general heading of digitalization, which no question will have a big impact on the carbon intensity of road freight in Europe over the next 5 to 10 years. But there have been some studies done. This was one by the International Energy Agency, published in 2017, which looked at how we decarbonize road freight. And in their analysis, they allowed for the fact that improved loading would make a contribution and improvements to energy efficiency. In fact, overall, they reckoned that logistical developments could contribute about 42% reduction in fuel consumption, which then translates into CO2 reductions as well. The Energy Transitions Commission has done work in this area as well, and they've gone a bit further, and they've actually quantified what they saw as potential CO2 reductions from things like supply chain collaboration, modal shift to rail, optimized use of the fleet and vehicle routing and so forth. And these are substantial reductions. So people haven't completely overlooked these operational and management measures. And the work that's been done suggests that these could be quite substantial. The problem is, however, if you examine the macro level statistics compiled by national governments or the EU, it does not inspire confidence in our ability to apply these operational measures. It gets back to the point that was made in the first keynote yesterday by Stefan Sieber, who said that we have known for a long time how we can improve load factors and reduce empty running, but nothing seems to change. And that's confirmed here. So this is, in the lower half of this slide, I've got data from the European, from Eurostat. So freight modal split, despite lots of government and EU initiatives over the years to get more freight onto the railways. In fact, the road network has been increasing its share of the market. In terms of empty running, look how it's hardly changed in 8 years. The average payload weight on trucks, again, fairly stable through time. So and people who look at this often feel that based on an historical experience, there's not much evidence of these operational trends heading in the right direction. And that's a matter of concern. And hopefully that will change. And one thing that will promote that change or act as a catalyst, it seems to me, is digitalization. But I think we have to face the fact that there are lots of constraints on the utilization of trucks. This comes from a book chapter I published some years ago. 10 things, it seems to me, which constrain the load factor on vehicles, and I've categorized them, as you can see, into 5 classes. It has to be said there are lots of perfectly good reasons for trucks not being full all of the time, and for there being a significant amount of empty money. I mean, often companies are not being lazy or irresponsible or inefficient in underloading their vehicles. They're often trading off lower vehicle use for greater efficiency in inventory management or in the way they run their warehouses and so forth. But nevertheless, I think we have to now start to prioritize vehicle loading. And I'd like to focus just on 3 things here. One is just time, second is truck size and weight constraints, and the third is supply chain collaboration. Because a lot of the blame for the underutilization of trucks is placed just in time, saying companies are prioritizing reducing inventory and being prepared there for running the vehicles half full, or much less, as that cartoon suggests. And so the argument is the time has come in a low carbon world to relax the just-in-time principle, to give companies more time to consolidate their loads and to find backloads, and also to switch freight to slower transport modes like rail and water. And the feeling is that in this post-COVID world, because companies will be placing greater emphasis on resilience, they may actually want to reduce some of these just-in-time pressures. But I always say you've got to be careful here, because just-in-time is not just a stock control system. It's a whole business philosophy designed to minimize waste, and that includes energy waste. So until we do a holistic analysis of CO2 emissions from the production and warehousing operations, as well as from transport, it's not necessarily the case that simply relaxing just in time will cut CO2 emissions overall. I think we've got to see transport within that logistical context. The other 2 things I mentioned, one was truck size and weight restrictions. I'm very positive about initiatives across Europe over the past decade, where companies have increased the maximum size and weight of trucks, because that then permits consolidation of loads. You can replace 3 vehicles by 2, and that cuts vehicle kilometers, cuts fuel consumption, and also CO2 emissions as well. And that trend, I think, is likely to continue. And then supply chain collaboration. Again, there's a lot of evidence now to show that when companies are prepared to share their vehicle capacity, you can drive down fuel consumption and CO2 emissions. This is a case study that was done of a collaboration involving Nestle and PepsiCo in the Benelux countries. And then seeing of how that will develop in the longer term, it will probably become a network-based system of collaboration. People call this the physical internet. Fernando Lize is one of the participants in this hackathon, representing Alice, and Alice has identified the physical internet as the long-term vision of logistics in Europe. And there's no question that if that develops, as I'm sure it will, that will help us to decarbonize our transport systems in Europe. But that's everything I've said so far relates to Europe. Let's just globalize it in the last few slides, because emissions from trucking in Europe represents only about 12% of all trucking emissions worldwide, right? Recent work by the International Transport Forum has forecast the rate at which trucking-related emissions will fall in different parts of the world. Okay, so here we're looking at the carbon intensity of trucking operations. The index here, as you can see, is tons of CO2 per vehicle kilometre. And Europe is expected to outpace the rest of the world in that respect. But look at Africa, the Middle East, India, where the projection is that the rate at which road freight will decarbonize is going to be relatively slow. Now, that's a problem because the same analysis by the International Transport Forum suggests that most of the future growth in CO2 emissions from road freight is going to come from the non-OECD countries, from the less developed parts of the world. And so the main growth of emissions is going to be in those regions where the rate of road freight decarbonisation is slowest. That's a problem. And if we look at this in terms of the energy efficiency of road freight, there are a whole series of reasons for that. In much of the rest of the world, people still enjoy diesel fuel subsidies, right? As you can see there, many countries still, seems rather perverse, but they subsidize the consumption of diesel fuel. The road infrastructure in many parts of the world, for some reason, right? Yeah. Road infrastructure is very poor, and that then impacts on the fuel efficiency of the vehicles. We've got chronic traffic congestion in many countries. Many of these countries run older vehicles, they're less well maintained. The drivers often have nodded training in eco-driving techniques. The operators in these countries work in intensely competitive markets, and as a result of these commercial pressures, don't have the time, energy, and resources really to focus on decarbonisation. And there's often weak regulation. Those regulations are often poorly enforced. If we just look at the regulations relating to the carbon intensity of new vehicles, what we are beginning to see is more and more countries in the world applying fuel economy standards for heavy-duty vehicles. Japan was the first, and then the US and China and so forth. But there are still many countries in the world, particularly in the less developed parts of the world, that do not have fuel economy standards in place. And many of these countries import their vehicles from Europe and from North America. So eventually they will be buying these more efficient trucks, but often there's a 5 to 10 year time lag before they then move into these less developed countries. And then I think this is my final slide. We have to ask the question, how long is it going to take for the new low carbon powertrain technologies to diffuse from Europe and North America into the less developed world? It may well take a long time, partly because it will take a while, I think, to install battery charging and gas refueling facilities in these countries. Again, if you look at the map on the right there, you can see how the carbon intensity of electricity in many of these parts of the world is much higher than it currently is in Europe. And even as those countries decarbonize electricity, the question is, will there be enough of that low carbon electricity to recharge trucks? And there's also the issue of the affordability of these new low carbon vehicles in those countries. And much of that relates to the global market for second-hand vehicles. So as I said, a lot of the freight that's moved in the less developed world is moved in trucks that had a first life in Europe and North America, and they're imported second-hand. And how is that second-hand market going to change as Europe and North America moves to the new generation of low-carbon trucks? Well, one of my worries is that Europe and North America will simply offload a lot of these older, less efficient internal combustion engine trucks into the developing world. If that happens, that will then depress the price of these vehicles in these other parts of the world, and that will further delay the switch to low-carbon vehicles. Also, it's expected that the new generation of battery-powered vehicles or fuel cell vehicles will have a longer lifespan in Europe and North America. And that will delay their entry, if you like, into the import market. Another thing is that there'll be a scarcity, it's reckoned, for some of the metals and batteries, like cobalt in particular, and also the platinum in fuel cells. And therefore, the governments of Europe and North America may not want to see the batteries and the fuel cells being exported. They will want to retain those materials to be recycled. And therefore, if this whole process of switching to low carbon vehicles elsewhere in the world is delayed, then governments won't have the same incentive to install the infrastructure that's required for this new generation of vehicles. So I have to say I'm rather pessimistic about the decarbonisation of road freight at a global level. So we might just say, why don't we just get rid of trucks and save us 2 billion tons of CO2 annually? Well, I think there's an obvious reason for that not working. This actually appears on a truck I saw in the south of England. Anyway, I thought we found that of interest. Those are my contact details. I'm going to be one of the experts supporting the Transportation for the Future project, and I look forward to working with some of you over the next 8 weeks as those projects are progressing. And that's a copy of my book on decarbonising logistics, which discusses all of this in a lot more detail. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan, for your extremely insightful pitch you gave us. I must admit you didn't leave a lot of questions open. There is still one which came up most recently, and I'd like to hear your view on this, is that the European Commission raised a question mark on the own mobility package, at least through the back door. There is this rule that in the latest mobility package, drivers should return the vehicles home, or the drivers should return home at least every 8 weeks. And in return, there came the suggestion that this would have an increasing impact to the CO2 emissions in Europe by something like 4.6%. From an academic point of view, how is your comment on that?
Well, I was actually involved in that study. This was the study that was done by Ricardo for the European Commission, and I was their advisor, right? So I'm part of that process. The study had 3 scenarios, right? So the one you've just described was in carbon terms the worst of the 3 scenarios, right? This is the one where the market doesn't really adjust very much, right? And therefore we see a significant increase in the empty running of vehicles. And that empty running can be quite significant. I mean, a truck going from Spain back to Poland, for example, that's about 1,800 kilometer distance, right? But the 2 other scenarios that they examined was one where the market does adjust. And some of the Eastern European hauliers, for example, would establish a base in a central or Western European country, which would have the effect then of reducing the amount of empty running, right? And I think that would result in maybe a 1 to 1.5% increase in CO2 emissions rather than the 4.6%. So it's very hard to predict which of these scenarios is the one which will materialize. I sympathize with the analysts who did the work because there's a lack of good data, and so a lot of assumptions had to be made along the way. Though they collected some new data, they also consulted with the industry. So I would say that the increase in CO2 is probably somewhere between the 4.6% figure you quoted and maybe a 1% figure. And we will see over the next few years, where it falls. But there are other things. This is to bring the drivers back. The drivers could be transported by plane or by bus, and we could leave the vehicles operating in those countries. So there are other ways around this issue.
Very good. Thank you so much, Alan. I don't want to stretch your engagement more than needed. And I would like to thank you once again